Hello everyone and welcome back to Midnight Encounters. Here on this channel I share real-life experiences with beings from beyond our world to help you unwind and drift into peaceful sleep. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Now find yourself a comfortable spot. Let the world around you fade away, and let's explore the unknown together. I was never someone who believed in any of this stuff. UFOs, aliens, unexplained phenomena, all of it seemed like something from movies or the imagination of people who maybe watched too much science fiction. I lived a pretty ordinary life, worked a normal job, had my routines and my predictable days. But sometimes life has a way of showing you that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than you ever thought possible. It started on a Thursday evening in late October. I remember the date because it was just a few days before Halloween, and there was something in the air that felt different. Not the usual autumn crispness, but something heavier, more electric. I was driving home from work, taking the same route I'd taken hundreds of times before, when I noticed something that made me pull over to the side of the road. The sky above me wasn't quite right. Now, I know how that sounds, like something someone would say if they were making up a story, but I'm telling you the truth. The stars were there, clear as always on a cold October night, but there was this section of sky that seemed darker than it should have been. Not cloud cover because I could see the edges clearly, but a perfect geometric shape that was just blocking out the light. I sat there in my car, engine still running, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape was triangular, massive, and it moved with a silence that felt wrong. No sound of engines, no mechanical noise, just this enormous craft drifting slowly across the sky like it was floating on invisible water. The edges were so sharp and clean that they seemed to cut the starlight in half. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in noticing this. Other cars had pulled over too. I could see people getting out of their vehicles, pointing up at the sky, some of them holding up their phones trying to capture what we were all witnessing. But here's the strange part, and this is something I still can't explain even now, years later. None of our phones were working. The screens would light up, but they wouldn't focus on the object. It was like the cameras couldn't see what our eyes were seeing so clearly. I remember getting out of my car and walking toward a small group of people who had gathered near the guardrail. Nobody was talking much, just quiet murmurs and whispers, like we were all afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell we were under. One woman kept saying, "Are you seeing this? Are you all seeing this?" as if she needed confirmation that she wasn't losing her mind. The craft moved slowly, deliberately, and as it passed directly overhead, I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't fear exactly, though there was certainly some of that. It was more like recognition, like some part of me that I didn't even know existed was responding to something familiar. The air around us felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up and my skin tingle. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the craft began to rise. Not quickly, not with any dramatic acceleration, but with the same steady, purposeful movement it had maintained the entire time. It climbed higher and higher until it was just another point of light among the stars, and then it was gone completely, leaving us all standing there in the cold October air, wondering if we had really seen what we thought we had seen. The strangest part came afterward. We all exchanged phone numbers, promised to stay in touch, to compare notes about what we had witnessed. But when I tried calling some of those people the next day, the numbers didn't work. When I went back to that same spot on the highway, looking for any evidence of what had happened, there was nothing. No skid marks from the cars that had pulled over, no footprints in the soft earth where we had all gathered. It was like the entire experience had been carefully erased, leaving only the memory and this persistent feeling that my understanding of the world had been fundamentally changed. I started paying attention to things I had never noticed before. The way shadows fell at certain times of day, the sounds that came from the forest behind my house late at night, the patterns that birds made when they flew overhead, as if they were spelling out messages in a language I couldn't quite decipher. I began reading everything I could find about similar experiences. Stories from people all over the world who had seen things that shouldn't exist, encountered beings that defied explanation, witnessed events that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality, and what I discovered was that I wasn't alone. There were thousands, maybe millions of people who had their own stories, their own moments when the veil between our world and something else had been lifted just enough to let them see through. Some of these stories were brief encounters, lasting only a few minutes but leaving an impression that lasted a lifetime. Others were more complex, involving direct contact, communication, even experiences that suggested these beings had been observing us for far longer than we might be comfortable knowing. Each story was unique, but they all shared certain elements. The sense of being in the presence of intelligence far beyond our own. The feeling that time itself behaved differently during these encounters, and always, the knowledge that what they had witnessed was real, regardless of how impossible it might seem to others. There was the commercial pilot who saw lights performing maneuvers that defied every law of physics he understood. The family camping in the remote wilderness who woke up to find their entire campsite had been rearranged while they slept, with no memory of how or when it had happened. The night shift worker who noticed the same strange figures appearing on security cameras, moving through spaces where no human should have been able to go. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex rather than clearer the more I learned about it. These weren't the wild fantasies of attention seekers or the delusions of unstable minds. These were ordinary people, living ordinary lives, who had extraordinary experiences that they couldn't explain but couldn't deny. What struck me most was how these encounters changed people, not in dramatic, obvious ways, but in subtle shifts in perspective that seemed to ripple outward through their entire lives. They became more aware of the mystery that surrounds us every day, more open to possibilities they had never considered before, more humble about humanity's place in a universe that suddenly seemed far more vast and populated than they had ever imagined. I started to understand that these experiences weren't just about seeing strange objects in the sky or encountering beings from other worlds. They were about expanding our conception of what's possible, challenging our assumptions about reality, and opening our minds to the idea that we might not be as alone in this universe as we sometimes feel. Tonight, I want to share some of these stories with you, not to convince you of anything in particular, but to invite you into this space of wonder and mystery that exists just at the edges of our everyday experience. These are tales of ordinary people who found themselves face to face with the extraordinary and whose lives were forever changed by what they encountered. So settle in, let your mind drift, and allow yourself to imagine what it might be like to step beyond the boundaries of the known world and into the realm of infinite possibility. Part 2. The Watchers in the Woods. The phenomenon started small, as these things often do. A missing hiker here, a strange light there, reports that could easily be dismissed as misunderstandings or hoaxes. But as the accounts began to accumulate, patterns emerged that defied conventional explanation. Deep in the remote wilderness areas of North America, something was watching, waiting, and occasionally making contact with those who ventured too far from the safety of civilization. Sarah Martinez had been a park ranger for over 15 years when she encountered something that would forever change her understanding of what lurked in the shadows between the trees. It was during a routine patrol in the Cascade Range, miles from the nearest road, when she first noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an oppressive, unnatural stillness that seemed to press against her eardrums like cotton. The forest around her had gone completely mute. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the towering pines standing motionless like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. Sarah had experienced this kind of silence before, usually just before severe weather moved in, but the sky above was crystal clear. She was checking her radio when she saw the first figure. It stood approximately 50 yards away, partially concealed behind a massive Douglas fir. At first glance, it appeared human in shape and size, but something about its posture struck her as fundamentally wrong. It stood too still, too straight, like a mannequin positioned by someone who had never quite understood how humans naturally hold themselves. Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely in the unnatural quiet. "Hello? Are you all right? Do you need assistance?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge her presence, remaining motionless as carved stone. Sarah began walking toward it, her hand instinctively moving to the radio on her belt. As she drew closer, details became clearer, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The figure was tall, at least 7 feet, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its frame. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with a waxy quality that reminded Sarah of old candles. But it was the face that truly disturbed her. Where features should have been, there was only smooth skin, unmarked by eyes, nose, or mouth. Yet somehow, she could feel it watching her. Sarah stopped walking, every instinct screaming at her to retreat. The figure began to move then, not walking but gliding across the forest floor without disturbing a single fallen leaf. Other shapes emerged from behind trees, all identical to the first, all moving with that same unsettling, soundless grace. She turned and ran. Sarah never spoke publicly about what happened next, but her incident report, buried deep in Park Service files, tells a story that defies rational explanation. According to her account, she ran for what felt like hours through a forest that had become a maze. Trails she had walked hundreds of times led to dead ends or looped back on themselves. The sun remained fixed in the sky, neither rising nor setting, as if time itself had become frozen. The faceless figures followed her, always visible in her peripheral vision but never directly pursuing. They seemed content to herd her, guiding her movement through the woods like shepherds managing livestock. When she finally emerged onto a familiar trail, gasping and exhausted, her watch showed that only 20 minutes had passed since she first spotted the figure. But Sarah's experience was far from unique. Similar encounters had been documented across the continent, from the deep forests of Maine to the remote wilderness of Alaska. The witnesses came from all walks of life: experienced outdoorsmen, casual hikers, hunters, and park rangers like Sarah. Their stories varied in detail, but shared the common elements that suggested something more than mass hysteria or hoax. Dr. James Whitfield, an anthropologist at the University of Vermont, had been collecting these accounts for over a decade when he agreed to share his research. His office was lined with filing cabinets filled with witness statements, photographs, and audio recordings. Most of the evidence was circumstantial, but the sheer volume was staggering. "The consistency is what's remarkable," Dr. Whitfield explained, pulling out a thick folder marked "Tall Figures, Northeast Region." Independent witnesses separated by hundreds of miles and years, describing virtually identical encounters. These aren't people looking for attention or trying to sell books. Many of them have never spoken publicly about their experiences. The reports described entities that stood between 7 and 9 feet tall, always pale, always featureless, always moving with that distinctive gliding motion. They appeared primarily in dense forest areas, far from human habitation, and seemed particularly drawn to lone travelers. Most encounters followed a similar pattern. An unnatural silence would fall over the area, the figures would appear, and the witness would experience a period of disorientation before finding themselves back on familiar ground. What disturbed Dr. Whitfield most was the psychological impact on the witnesses. These are rational, stable individuals, he said. Hunters who've spent their entire lives in the woods, park rangers with decades of experience, people who know the difference between a bear and something else entirely, and they're all fundamentally changed by these encounters. The psychological effects were indeed profound. Many witnesses reported difficulty sleeping, recurring nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of being watched whenever they entered forested areas. Some abandoned outdoor activities entirely, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond their vision. Others became obsessed, returning again and again to the sites of their encounters, hoping to make contact or find answers. Marcus Chen fell into the latter category. A software engineer from Seattle, he had been an avid backpacker until his encounter in Olympic National Park. His experience began like so many others: the unnatural silence, the sense of being watched, the appearance of the tall, pale figures. But Marcus's encounter went further than most. "They communicated with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not with words, but somehow I could understand what they wanted. They were curious about us, about humans, the way we might be curious about ants." According to Marcus, the entities had been observing human activity in the wilderness for far longer than anyone realized. They were not malevolent, he insisted, but their interest in humanity was clinical, detached. They viewed humans as a species to be studied, cataloged, and occasionally collected. "They showed me things," Marcus continued. "Images somehow projected directly into my mind. I saw other people, other encounters, people who had gone into the woods and never come out. Not all of them, but some, the ones who were interesting to them." Marcus's claims were impossible to verify, but they aligned with troubling statistics that Dr. Whitfield had been tracking. The number of unexplained disappearances in remote wilderness areas had been steadily increasing over the past 2 decades. While most could be attributed to natural causes, accidents, or simple human error, a significant percentage remained complete mysteries. These cases shared common characteristics: experienced outdoorsmen vanishing without a trace, extensive search efforts yielding no evidence, and occasional reports of strange lights or figures in the area around the time of disappearance. In some cases, personal belongings were found arranged in neat patterns miles from where the person was last seen, as if someone had carefully sorted through and displayed the items. The official explanation was always the same: the wilderness was dangerous, people made mistakes, and nature was unforgiving. But the families of the missing knew there was more to the story. They spoke of loved ones who had been hiking and camping for decades without incident, people who knew the woods better than their own neighborhoods. These weren't inexperienced tourists getting lost on day hikes. These were experts who had simply vanished. Local indigenous communities had their own explanations for the disappearances and sightings. Elder Joseph Crowfeather of the Quinault Nation had grown up hearing stories about the tall ones from his grandfather, who had heard them from his grandfather before him. "My people have always known about them," Elder Crowfeather said during a rare interview. "They are not spirits, not demons. They are something else, something that has been here longer than us. Usually, they keep to themselves, stay hidden in the deep places where humans don't go. But something has changed. They're becoming bolder, more active." According to tribal oral histories, the tall ones had always existed at the edges of human awareness, occasionally making contact, but generally content to remain hidden. They were described as watchers, beings whose purpose was to observe and record the activities of other species. The stories suggested they were not native to Earth, but had been present for so long that they had become part of the natural order. Our ancestors made agreements with them, Elder Crowfeather explained. Certain areas were theirs, certain times were theirs. We stayed away from the deep places during the dark moon, and they stayed away from our villages and camps. But the white man didn't know these agreements, didn't understand the boundaries. As human activity in wilderness areas increased, these ancient boundaries had been repeatedly crossed. Hiking trails penetrated deeper into previously untouched forests. Recreational vehicles carried people into areas that had been avoided for generations, and modern technology allowed humans to venture into terrain that would have been inaccessible to their ancestors. The Tall Ones, according to tribal accounts, were responding to these incursions the only way they knew how, by studying the intruders, trying to understand their motivations and capabilities. Most of the time, this observation went unnoticed. Humans would feel watched, experience brief moments of unease, but never realize they were being carefully examined by intelligences far older than civilization. But sometimes the observation became interaction. Rebecca Torres learned this firsthand during a solo camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains. An experienced wilderness photographer, she had spent 3 days in a remote area documenting wildlife when she noticed the signs. First came the silence, that oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle even her own heartbeat. Then came the feeling of being watched, a sensation so intense it made her skin crawl. On the third night, as she sat by her campfire editing photos on her laptop, they appeared. There were 5 of them, she recalled, her hands shaking as she described the encounter. They just materialized out of the darkness like they'd been there all along. They stood at the edge of the firelight, perfectly still, perfectly silent. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could feel them looking at me, studying me. Rebecca sat frozen for what felt like hours, afraid to move or speak. The entities made no threatening gestures, showed no signs of aggression, but their presence was overwhelming. They radiated an alien intelligence that made her feel small and insignificant, like a butterfly pinned to a specimen board. Then one of them stepped forward, she continued. It reached out with one long, pale hand and touched my camera. Not roughly, very gently, like it was curious about the technology. When it pulled its hand away, the camera was completely dead. Not just the battery, but everything. It wouldn't even turn on anymore. The entity then gestured toward Rebecca's laptop, which was still displaying her photographs. The screen began cycling through her images on its own, pausing on certain shots. The beings seemed particularly interested in photos of animals and landscapes, less interested in any that included human-made objects or structures. It was like they were cataloging, Rebecca said, taking note of what I had seen and recorded. When they finished looking at the photos, they just left. They didn't walk away, they just faded back into the darkness like smoke. Rebecca packed up immediately and hiked out in the dark, using her phone's flashlight to navigate the treacherous mountain trails. When she reached civilization and had her camera examined by a technician, the diagnosis was baffling. Every electronic component had been somehow reset to factory defaults, but there was no physical damage whatsoever. The photographs on her laptop remained intact, but something had been added. Mixed in with her wildlife shots were images she didn't remember taking. Pictures of herself sleeping in her tent, sitting by the campfire, hiking along the trail. The photos were taken from impossible angles, as if the camera had been floating 20 feet in the air. Dr. Whitfield had collected dozens of similar accounts, each adding another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every new report. The pattern was clear. The entities were systematically documenting human activity in wilderness areas, using methods that defied current understanding of physics and technology. But the documentation went beyond simple observation. Several witnesses reported finding their personal belongings rearranged in their absence, organized in ways that suggested a methodical cataloging process. Items would be sorted by material, size, or function, then carefully replaced in their original locations. Nothing was ever stolen, but the message was clear. Everything the humans brought into the wilderness was being examined and recorded. The implications were unsettling. If these entities possessed the technology to manipulate electronic devices and observe humans undetected, what else were they capable of? And more importantly, what was their ultimate purpose? Some researchers theorized that the Tall Ones were conducting a comprehensive study of human civilization, gathering data for unknown purposes. Others suggested they might be preparing for some form of contact, studying human behavior to better understand how to interact with the species. The most disturbing theory proposed that they were evaluating humanity's impact on the environment, possibly determining whether humans posed a threat that needed to be addressed. Whatever their purpose, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The encounters were becoming more frequent and more direct. Where once the entities had remained hidden, content to observe from a distance, they were now making their presence known to human witnesses. The question that haunted researchers was whether this represented a natural progression in their study of humanity, or a sign that their long period of passive observation was coming to an end. The truth, as always, remained elusive. The Tall Ones continued their silent vigil in the deep forests, watching, waiting, and recording. They left behind only questions, blurred photographs, and the profound certainty in their witnesses that humanity was not alone in the wilderness. In the shadows between the trees, ancient eyes continued to watch, and somewhere in the darkness, decisions were being made about the future of both species. For those who had encountered them, the woods would never be the same. Every rustle of leaves might hide a watcher. Every moment of silence might herald their approach. The wilderness, once a refuge from the complexities of modern life, had become something far more complex and dangerous. And in the growing collection of witness accounts and unexplained disappearances, a new chapter in the relationship between humanity and the unknown was being written, one encounter at a time. The encounters I've shared so far are just the beginning of something much larger, something that's been unfolding across decades of documented experiences. What you're about to hear represents a shift in the phenomenon itself, a movement from distant observation to something far more direct and unsettling. I was stationed at a remote weather monitoring facility in northern Canada when everything I thought I knew about reality began to unravel. The facility was small, just 3 of us rotating shifts to maintain the equipment and record atmospheric data. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another human being, surrounded by nothing but endless forest and the occasional caribou herd. The first sign something was wrong came through our communications array. We'd been picking up strange interference for weeks, not the usual static or solar activity, but something rhythmic, almost musical. The patterns were too complex to be natural, too structured to be random equipment failure. My colleague Sarah, who had a background in signal analysis, spent hours trying to decode the transmissions. She said they reminded her of language, but not any language she'd ever encountered. Then the sightings began. At first, they were subtle, just lights moving through the tree line at impossible speeds. The objects didn't behave like aircraft. They moved with a fluid grace that defied physics as we understood it. They would hover motionlessly for hours, then accelerate to incredible velocities in the blink of an eye. No sound, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion. The third member of our team, Dr. Martinez, was a meteorologist with over 20 years of experience. He'd seen every atmospheric phenomenon you could imagine, but even he couldn't explain what we were witnessing. The objects seemed to interact with our weather systems, appearing before storms and disappearing when the skies cleared. It was as if they were studying our planet's atmospheric behavior, learning from each weather pattern. As the weeks passed, the encounters became more frequent and more direct. The beings, for lack of a better term, began to reveal themselves. They were tall, impossibly thin, with movements that seemed to flow like water. Their skin had a translucent quality, and their eyes were large and dark, reflecting intelligence that felt ancient beyond measure. The first direct contact came on a night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in brilliant greens and purples. Sarah was outside taking readings when she suddenly went silent on the radio. Dr. Martinez and I found her standing perfectly still in the snow, her eyes fixed on a point in the sky where a craft hovered silently above the tree line. She wasn't frightened. She seemed peaceful, almost serene. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. She described visions of vast cities among the stars, civilizations that had risen and fallen while Earth was still forming. She spoke of watchers, beings who had been observing our world since the dawn of consciousness, waiting for humanity to reach a certain threshold of development. The beings communicated not through words, but through direct transfer of knowledge and emotion. They showed us glimpses of their technology, machines that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, powered by forces we couldn't comprehend. They revealed that what we called UFO sightings were merely the three-dimensional shadows of their true forms, like how a sphere passing through a flat plane would appear as a circle to two-dimensional beings. But perhaps most unsettling were the warnings they shared. They spoke of critical junctures in planetary development, moments when civilizations either transcended their limitations or destroyed themselves. They had witnessed this cycle countless times across the galaxy, and they suggested that humanity was approaching such a moment. The encounters at the facility continued for months, each interaction revealing more about these beings and their purpose. They weren't invaders in any traditional sense, but neither were they entirely benevolent observers. They were something else entirely, entities operating according to motivations and ethics that human minds could barely grasp. Dr. Martinez began experiencing what he called temporal displacement episodes. He would lose hours at a time, only to find himself in locations miles from the facility with no memory of how he'd gotten there. During these episodes, he claimed to have been shown possible futures for humanity, both magnificent and terrifying. He spoke of technologies that could heal the planet or devastate it, depending on how they were used. The beings seemed particularly interested in our emotional responses to their presence. They would observe our reactions with the detached curiosity of scientists studying laboratory specimens. Fear, wonder, confusion, acceptance. They cataloged each emotion as if building a comprehensive database of human psychology. As winter deepened, the encounters took on a more urgent quality. The beings began showing us images of other worlds they had observed, planets where civilizations had failed to navigate the crucial transition period. Dead worlds, their surfaces scarred by wars fought with technologies beyond our current understanding. They made it clear that such outcomes were not inevitable, but they were disturbingly common. The final encounter came during a blizzard that cut us off from the outside world for nearly a week. The facility's power failed, and we found ourselves in total darkness, save for the eerie glow that emanated from the craft hovering directly overhead. The beings descended, not in physical form but as presences that filled our minds with their alien thoughts and perspectives. They shared with us a choice that humanity would soon face, a decision that would determine whether our species joined the community of spacefaring civilizations or followed the path of so many others into extinction. They couldn't make this choice for us, they explained, but they could prepare certain individuals to help guide humanity when the time came. Each of us was marked in some way during that final encounter, changed on a fundamental level that we're still trying to understand. We became bridges between their world and ours, conduits for information that would be revealed gradually as humanity proved ready to receive it. When the storm cleared and rescue teams finally reached the facility, we found ourselves unable to speak of what we'd experienced. Not because we'd been silenced or threatened, but because the knowledge we'd gained was so vast and complex that human language seemed inadequate to convey it. The official reports mentioned equipment failures and temporary isolation, nothing more. Years have passed since those encounters, and the three of us have gone our separate ways. But we remain connected, part of a larger network of individuals who have been touched by these beings. We can sense others like us, people who carry the same mark, the same burden of knowledge about what's coming. The beings are still out there, still watching, still preparing for the moment when humanity will be forced to make its choice. They've been patient for millennia, but that patience isn't infinite. The signs are everywhere for those who know how to look. In the increasing frequency of sightings, in the subtle changes to our planet's magnetic field, in the strange dreams that more and more people report having. What we experienced at that remote facility was just one small part of a much larger plan. A careful orchestration of contact and revelation that spans the globe. The beings aren't just studying us anymore, they're preparing us slowly and methodically for what's to come. The question isn't whether contact will happen, it's whether humanity will be ready when it does. And based on what I witnessed during those long winter nights, surrounded by intelligences beyond our comprehension, I'm not sure we will be. But perhaps that uncertainty, that capacity for growth and change in the face of the unknown, is exactly what they're looking for. The choice is coming, whether we're ready or not. And when it arrives, the encounters I've shared tonight will seem like gentle whispers compared to the symphony of revelation that awaits us all. The night air was still, carrying only the faint hum of insects and the distant whisper of wind through the trees. I had been working alone in the observatory for months, tracking atmospheric anomalies that defied conventional explanation. Each reading told the same impossible story. Something was systematically observing our planet, learning our patterns, cataloging our responses. The encounters had begun subtly. A farmer in Montana reported perfect circles burned into his field, appearing overnight without explanation. The grass wasn't dead, it was compressed, as if something massive had hovered just above the earth, studying the terrain below. Security cameras captured nothing but empty fields, yet the evidence remained. Precise geometric patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond our understanding. Then came the reports from the pharmaceutical district. Night shift workers described pale figures with movements too fluid to be human, their eyes reflecting light that shouldn't exist. These beings appeared at the same hour each evening, requesting medications that didn't exist for conditions that had no name. They paid with exact change and vanished into darkness, leaving behind only the lingering sensation that someone was cataloging our most intimate vulnerabilities. Musicians began dreaming in harmonies that human instruments couldn't reproduce. The melodies came with a weight of ancient knowledge, notes that seemed to carry the memory of civilizations that predated our understanding of time. When they tried to play these impossible compositions, their fingers moved with precision they had never learned, as if something was guiding them toward a revelation that humanity wasn't ready to comprehend. The truth emerged slowly, piece by piece, like fragments of a message written in a language we were only beginning to understand. Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, research teams uncovered chambers filled with technology that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. The walls displayed symbols that shifted when observed directly, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to respond to human thought itself. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports from those who had made direct contact. They spoke of beings who communicated not through words, but through the transfer of pure understanding. These entities offered healing for terminal illnesses, knowledge that could solve humanity's greatest challenges, solutions to problems we hadn't yet recognized we faced. Yet each offer came with a price that extended far beyond material exchange. They wanted something deeper, something that defined the very essence of what it meant to be human. The pattern became clear when I began connecting the scattered reports from around the globe. Every encounter, every sighting, every inexplicable phenomenon pointed to the same conclusion. We were being studied with the methodical precision of scientists observing a laboratory experiment. The beings weren't invading. They were preparing us for something far more significant than conquest. As I compiled the evidence, one reality became undeniable. They had been here for generations, perhaps centuries, watching our evolution with patient interest. Every technological advancement, every cultural shift, every moment of human triumph or tragedy had been observed and recorded by intelligences that viewed our species as subjects in an experiment whose scope we couldn't begin to fathom. The encounters were increasing in frequency and directness. What had once been subtle observations from the shadows were becoming open communications. They were no longer content to simply watch. They were beginning to make contact with individuals who possessed qualities they deemed valuable for whatever transformation they had planned. Some had already accepted their role as bridges between worlds, allowing these entities to experience human emotion and understanding through willing hosts. Others had refused, choosing to retain their humanity despite the knowledge and power being offered. Each choice carried consequences that rippled through families, communities, and the fabric of reality itself. The most chilling revelation came from analyzing the timeline of encounters. The frequency wasn't random. It was building toward something specific, a moment when the observation phase would end and something far more significant would begin. We weren't just being studied, we were being prepared for a transformation that would fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. As I write these words, I can feel their presence pressing at the edges of my consciousness. They know I've uncovered their pattern, understood their purpose. The choice they offer isn't really a choice at all. It's an invitation to participate in humanity's next evolutionary step, willing or not. The question that haunts me isn't whether they exist. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether humanity is ready for what comes next, and whether our species will survive the revelation that we were never alone, never truly free, and never the masters of our own destiny that we believed ourselves to be. The encounters continue, each one bringing us closer to a moment when the careful balance between observation and intervention will shift forever. When that moment arrives, the choice will no longer be individual. It will be collective, and it will determine whether humanity emerges transformed or ceases to exist as we know it. They are patient, but their patience is not infinite. The time for preparation is ending, and the time for revelation has begun. Part 5 continues the deep exploration of humanity's evolving relationship with these ancient watchers, revealing how contact has moved from distant observation to active intervention in human affairs. The entities known across cultures as the Tall Ones or the Watchers have been present throughout human history, their influence woven into the fabric of our development. What began as passive surveillance has transformed into something far more complex and urgent. Recent encounters suggest these beings are no longer content to simply observe. They are actively preparing humanity for a critical decision point that will determine our species' future. Military personnel report unprecedented encounters where standard protocols fail completely. Fighter pilots describe craft that defy known physics, moving with impossible precision while remaining completely silent. These vessels demonstrate technology so advanced that our most sophisticated equipment becomes useless in their presence. Radar systems malfunction, communications cut out, and even the most experienced pilots find themselves helpless against maneuvers that should be impossible. The psychological impact on witnesses cannot be understated. Those who encounter these entities often describe a profound sense of being evaluated, as if their very thoughts and intentions are being cataloged and assessed. Some report direct mental contact, not through words, but through pure understanding that bypasses language entirely. These communications often carry warnings about humanity's trajectory, suggesting that we stand at a crossroads where our choices will echo across cosmic time. Archaeological evidence supports the notion that this relationship spans millennia. Ancient sites worldwide contain symbols and structures that seem designed according to principles beyond human understanding at the time of their creation. These locations often become focal points for modern encounters, as if the entities are returning to check on markers they placed long ago. The pattern of contact is accelerating. Where once encounters were isolated and rare, they now occur with increasing frequency across multiple continents. The entities seem particularly drawn to areas where humanity's impact on the environment is most severe, appearing near nuclear facilities, sites of ecological destruction, and regions experiencing rapid technological development. Perhaps most unsettling is the growing evidence that some humans have been selected for ongoing contact. These individuals report recurring encounters spanning years or even decades, during which they receive increasingly complex information about humanity's place in a larger cosmic community. They describe being shown visions of possible futures, some filled with unimaginable wonder, others with devastating consequences. The entity's message, when it can be understood, is both urgent and cryptic. They speak of a coming decision that humanity must make collectively, a choice that will determine whether our species joins a broader galactic community or faces isolation, or worse. The criteria for this evaluation appear to center on our capacity for wisdom, our treatment of our planet, and our ability to move beyond destructive patterns that have defined much of human history. Scientists and researchers who have studied these phenomena note consistent elements across all encounters. The entities demonstrate technology that appears to manipulate space and time itself. They show detailed knowledge of human history and psychology, and they express what can only be described as deep concern for humanity's current trajectory. The implications are staggering. If these accounts are accurate, humanity is being observed and evaluated by intelligences so advanced that our entire civilization might be considered a single experiment in their vast catalog of worlds. The question becomes not whether we are alone in the universe, but whether we will prove worthy of the cosmic inheritance that awaits us. As encounters continue to increase in both frequency and intensity, the veil between our world and theirs grows thinner. The time of passive observation appears to be ending. What comes next will depend entirely on choices we make not just as individuals, but as a species standing at the threshold of either transcendence or transformation into something we cannot yet imagine. The watchers are no longer simply watching. They are waiting for our answer. I was driving back from my brother's place late at night when something happened that I still can't explain. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing everything beyond my headlights. That's when I saw the light. It wasn't gradual. 1 second, normal fog. The next, blinding white light directly in front of my windshield, like I'd driven into an invisible wall of pure energy. Everything went white. I couldn't see my hands, the dashboard, nothing. Just this pressing, overwhelming brightness that filled the entire car. Then it was gone. Just like that. No fade, no warning. Complete darkness again. My car clock said 12:34 when I got home, but my phone showed 1:07. Same with the microwave inside. That drive should have taken 25 minutes tops. I'd lost over half an hour somewhere in that fog, and I have no memory of where those minutes went. The strangest part wasn't the missing time or even the impossible light. It was how the fog had this perfect boundary. Behind me, thick as soup. Ahead of me, clear as day, like someone had drawn a line in the air. I've driven that road hundreds of times since, but never in the fog. Something about that night felt like crossing into a place I wasn't supposed to be. And whatever was waiting in that light, I'm not sure I want to meet it again. Sometimes the most unsettling encounters aren't the ones with clear explanations. They're the moments when reality seems to bend just slightly, leaving you with questions that have no answers, and time that simply disappears into the white. The reports kept coming in, each one more unsettling than the last. I'd been documenting these encounters for months now, and what started as isolated incidents had become something much larger, much more coordinated. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. It was a park ranger in Montana who first mentioned the lights. Not the usual aircraft or weather phenomena, but something else entirely. Geometric formations that appeared in the sky just before dawn, moving in perfect synchronization. He'd been tracking them for weeks, always in the same sector, always following the same route through the valley where the disappearances had been reported. The lights weren't random. They formed patterns, intricate designs that seemed to pulse with intelligence. Triangular formations that would shift into perfect circles, then stretch into lines that spanned miles across the sky. Each configuration lasted exactly 17 minutes before dissolving into the pre-dawn darkness. What made his report different was the aftermath. Every morning, after the lights appeared, the wildlife in that section of the park would be found in strange arrangements. Deer standing motionless in perfect geometric patterns, birds perched in trees forming precise mathematical sequences. They weren't harmed, just positioned, as if something had gently guided them into formation during the night. The ranger had started leaving trail cameras throughout the area, hoping to capture whatever was orchestrating these displays. When he reviewed the footage, he found something that made his hands shake as he called it in. The animals weren't being moved, they were moving themselves, walking calmly into position as those lights pulsed overhead. Their eyes reflected the strange illumination, but their movements were too deliberate, too purposeful for normal animal behavior. Then came the report from Dr. Sarah Chen, an atmospheric physicist studying weather patterns in the Pacific Northwest. She'd been tracking unusual electromagnetic readings for months, anomalies that didn't match any known natural phenomena. The readings always peaked during the early morning hours, specifically between 3 and 4 a.m., and always in locations where people had reported encounters with tall, pale figures. Dr. Chen's instruments detected energy signatures that defied conventional understanding. Electromagnetic fields that seemed to bend space around them, creating pockets of distorted reality where the normal rules of physics appeared to break down. Temperature readings that showed perfect geometric patterns of heat and cold, as if the very air was being arranged with mathematical precision. What troubled her most was the consistency. These weren't random energy bursts or atmospheric quirks. They were systematic, methodical, following patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. The energy signatures were growing stronger each month, as if whatever was generating them was becoming more active, more present in our world. A commercial pilot flying the red-eye route between Denver and Seattle reported seeing the formations from 30,000 feet. Massive geometric shapes outlined in soft, pulsing light, moving slowly across the landscape below. He'd been flying for 20 years and had never seen anything like it. The shapes weren't aircraft, weren't weather phenomena, weren't anything in his experience or training. When he tried to radio air traffic control about the formations, his communications went dead. Not static, not interference, just complete silence. His instruments continued to function normally, but for the 15 minutes the shapes remained visible below. He might as well have been flying through a void. No radio contact, no GPS signals, no connection to the outside world. The most disturbing detail came from a meteorologist in Colorado who had been tracking these atmospheric anomalies for months. She noticed that the electromagnetic disturbances were occurring in a specific pattern, a sequence that was slowly spiraling inward toward the major population centers. What had started as isolated incidents in remote wilderness areas was gradually moving closer to cities, to places where millions of people lived and worked. Her data showed a timeline, a progression that suggested these manifestations weren't random at all. They were following a plan, a schedule that seemed to be building towards something. The frequency was increasing, the intensity growing stronger, and the locations were becoming more strategic. It was as if something was preparing, positioning itself for a larger event. I received a call from a seismologist who had been monitoring underground activity in regions where the encounters were reported. She'd detected vibrations deep beneath the earth, rhythmic pulses that didn't match any known geological activity. The vibrations weren't random earthquake tremors or tectonic shifts. They were too regular, too precise, forming patterns that suggested artificial origin. The underground pulses were synchronized with the atmospheric disturbances Dr. Chen had been tracking. When the electromagnetic anomalies peaked above ground, the seismic activity intensified below. It was as if something was communicating between the surface and the depths, coordinating activities across multiple dimensions of our reality. What made this even more unsettling was the discovery that these underground vibrations were creating changes in the Earth itself. Mineral formations were being altered, cave systems were being modified, and underground water patterns were being redirected. Whatever was causing these vibrations wasn't just passing through, it was reshaping the very foundation of the landscape. A geologist studying these changes found evidence of artificial structures deep underground, geometric formations that couldn't have occurred naturally. When core samples were analyzed, they revealed materials that didn't match anything in the known geological record. Elements that seemed to exist in impossible combinations, arranged in patterns that suggested advanced technology. The structures appeared to be growing, expanding through the underground network of caves and tunnels that connected these various locations. It was as if something was building a vast subterranean infrastructure, creating a hidden network that spanned hundreds of miles beneath the Earth's surface. Military satellites had begun detecting unusual thermal signatures in these same regions. Heat patterns that formed perfect geometric shapes, visible only through infrared imaging. The patterns would appear for brief periods, always during the early morning hours, then fade back into the normal background temperature of the landscape. Intelligence analysts studying these thermal images noticed that the patterns weren't random. They formed symbols, complex designs that seemed to carry meaning. When computer programs were used to analyze the mathematical relationships within these thermal patterns, they revealed a level of sophistication that suggested advanced intelligence. The symbols were changing over time, evolving and becoming more complex. What had started as simple geometric shapes were becoming intricate designs that seemed to contain vast amounts of information. It was as if something was using the very heat of the earth to write messages across the landscape, communications that could only be read from space. A linguistics professor who specialized in ancient writing systems was brought in to analyze these thermal patterns. She discovered that the symbols contained mathematical relationships found in the most advanced human civilizations, but arranged in ways that suggested knowledge far beyond our current understanding. The patterns seemed to be teaching, demonstrating concepts that humanity was only beginning to comprehend. What emerged from her analysis was the realization that these weren't just random symbols. They were forming a language, a complex system of communication that was being written across hundreds of square miles of territory. Someone or something was creating a massive text, a document that could only be read by beings capable of seeing the entire landscape from above. The message seemed to be directed not at individuals, but at our species as a whole. It was a communication meant for those who had achieved a certain level of technological advancement, those who could monitor the Earth from space and detect patterns across vast distances. We were being tested, evaluated on our ability to recognize and interpret these cosmic communications. As I compiled these reports, the scope of what was happening became clear. This wasn't a series of isolated incidents or random encounters. It was a coordinated effort, a systematic approach to making contact with humanity. The Watchers weren't just observing anymore. They were actively preparing for something, arranging the pieces for an event that would change everything. The underground structures, the atmospheric disturbances, the thermal patterns, the behavioral changes in wildlife, all of it was connected. A vast network was being established, infrastructure for something unprecedented in human history. We were witnessing the preparation for first contact, but not in the way science fiction had imagined. This wasn't going to be ships landing on the White House lawn or dramatic announcements to world leaders. This was subtle, methodical, designed to gradually acclimate humanity to a new reality. The Watchers understood that sudden, dramatic contact would cause panic and chaos. Instead, they were slowly revealing themselves, allowing us to adjust to their presence before making their intentions fully known. The pattern of escalation was clear. What had begun as brief glimpses and fleeting encounters was becoming more direct, more obvious. The infrastructure being built would soon be complete, and when it was, the next phase would begin. Humanity was being prepared for something that would fundamentally change our understanding of our place in the universe. The question was no longer whether contact would happen, but whether we would be ready when it did. The Watchers had been patient, methodical in their approach, but their timeline was accelerating. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to look, and soon they would be impossible for anyone to ignore. The age of secret observations and hidden encounters was coming to an end. The infrastructure was nearly complete, the preparations almost finished. What came next would determine not just the future of human civilization, but our role in a cosmic community that had been watching and waiting for us to prove we were ready to join them. But as these reports continued to arrive, as the evidence mounted and the patterns became undeniable, one thing remained clear. The Watchers had been among us far longer than anyone had imagined, and their influence on human development had been far more profound than we could have ever suspected. We weren't just being contacted by an alien civilization. We were being reunited with one. The forest felt different that morning. I'd been working as a park ranger for over 15 years, and I thought I knew every sound, every shadow, every rhythm of the wilderness. But something had shifted overnight. something that made my skin crawl the moment I stepped out of the ranger station. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you'd expect in the early hours, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. No birds, no rustling leaves. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the trees frozen like they were holding their breath. I grabbed my radio and coffee, starting my usual morning patrol along the main trail. That's when I saw them. The trees. Every single pine along a quarter-mile stretch had been stripped of bark in perfect horizontal bands, each strip exactly 3 feet wide, running around the entire circumference of the trunk. The exposed wood underneath was smooth, almost polished, like it had been sanded by machine. I've seen bear damage, insect infestations, even vandalism, but nothing like this. The precision was unnatural. Each band was positioned at the exact same height on every tree, regardless of the tree's size or age. It was as if something had methodically worked its way through the forest with surgical accuracy. I radioed back to headquarters, my voice echoing strangely in the dead air. Static answered me. I tried again. Nothing but white noise. My phone showed full bars but wouldn't connect to any network. The GPS device on my belt spun wildly, unable to lock onto any satellites. As I moved deeper into the affected area, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Embedded in the stripped bark of several trees were symbols, not carved, but somehow burned into the wood. They weren't like any writing I'd ever seen. The marks were geometric, precise, arranged in complex patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I pulled out my camera to document the symbols, but every photo came out distorted. The images showed the trees clearly enough, but where the symbols should have been, there were only dark smudges, as if the camera couldn't properly register what it was seeing. That's when I heard it, a low humming that seemed to come from underground. The sound vibrated through the soles of my boots, a deep thrumming that made my teeth ache. I knelt and pressed my hand to the earth. The soil was warm, almost hot, and I could feel something pulsing beneath the surface like a massive heartbeat. The humming grew stronger, and the symbols on the trees began to glow with a faint blue light. The air around me shimmered like heat waves, and I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Tall, pale figures drifting between the trees just beyond clear sight. I tried to approach one of these figures, but as soon as I moved toward it, it would fade like morning mist. They weren't hiding exactly. It was more like they existed just slightly out of phase with reality, visible only when I wasn't trying to see them directly. The investigation team arrived 3 days later, after I'd filed my report through the emergency satellite phone back at the station. They found the stripped trees, photographed the symbols, and took soil samples from the areas where the ground was warm. But their instruments detected nothing unusual. Their cameras captured the symbols clearly. Their GPS units worked perfectly. It was as if whatever had been there had decided to reveal itself only to me, leaving just enough evidence to prove I wasn't losing my mind, but not enough for anyone else to truly understand what had happened. The official report listed it as unexplained environmental damage, possibly caused by unknown weather phenomena. The symbols were dismissed as natural burn patterns from lightning strikes. The warm soil was attributed to underground thermal activity. But I know what I experienced. Those figures weren't weather phenomena. The precision of the bark stripping wasn't natural, and the way the symbols seemed to communicate something just beyond my understanding, that wasn't random lightning damage. I've continued working these woods for 2 years since that morning, and the affected area has never fully recovered. The trees still bear their scars, and on certain nights when the air is still and heavy, I can hear that same underground humming. Sometimes I catch glimpses of those tall figures in the distance, always watching, always just out of reach. The other rangers avoid that section of forest now. They say it feels wrong, though none of them can explain why. Hikers report feeling watched, experiencing equipment malfunctions, and finding their compasses spinning uselessly. Most turn back before completing the trail. I've started keeping detailed logs of every anomaly, every strange sound, every moment when the forest feels like it's holding its breath. The patterns are becoming clearer. The activity follows lunar cycles, intensifies during certain weather conditions, and always involves that same surgical precision that first caught my attention. Whatever marked those trees, whatever created those symbols, it's still out there, still watching, still waiting for something I can't begin to understand. And every morning when I start my patrol, I wonder if today will be the day it decides to reveal itself completely. The forest remembers everything. And now, so do I. But remembering and understanding are two very different things, and I'm beginning to suspect that some knowledge comes with a price I'm not sure I'm ready to pay. The encounters were escalating. What had begun as passive observation was becoming something far more deliberate, more invasive. The beings that had shadowed humanity for decades were no longer content to simply watch from the periphery. They were making contact, and the implications were staggering. Dr. Sarah Chen had been studying atmospheric anomalies for the National Weather Service when the calls started coming in. Pilots from 3 different airlines reported the same phenomenon over the Pacific Northwest. A massive disturbance in the upper atmosphere, visible only on certain radar frequencies, moving against all known weather patterns. What made it truly unsettling was its behavior. It wasn't drifting with the wind currents or following any meteorological logic. It was responding to air traffic, shifting course to avoid commercial flights with an intelligence that defied explanation. The first pilot to encounter it directly was Captain James Morrison, a 20-year veteran flying a red-eye from Seattle to Denver. He was cruising at 35,000 feet when his instruments began fluctuating wildly. The altimeter spun in circles, the compass needle danced erratically, and the radio filled with static that sounded almost musical. Through his cockpit window, he saw it. A massive shape, translucent and shimmering, easily the size of a football stadium, moving alongside his aircraft with impossible grace. Morrison tried to radio air traffic control, but his communications were completely dead. The thing stayed with him for nearly 10 minutes, matching his speed perfectly, never coming close enough to pose a danger, but making its presence unmistakably known. When it finally departed, accelerating upward at a rate that should have been physically impossible, Morrison's instruments returned to normal as if nothing had happened. The official report listed it as equipment malfunction. But Morrison wasn't the only one. Over the following weeks, similar encounters were reported across the globe. A cargo pilot over the Atlantic described a formation of lights that arranged themselves into complex geometric patterns before vanishing. A helicopter crew in Alaska watched as their aircraft was surrounded by dozens of small, glowing orbs that moved with perfect synchronization. Each time, the encounters followed the same pattern. Total electronic interference during the event, followed by complete system recovery afterward, as if the phenomena were deliberately limiting their technological footprint. The beings weren't just in the skies anymore. They were in our cities, walking among us in forms we could barely comprehend. Rebecca Martinez was working the night shift at a downtown hospital when she first saw one. It appeared human at first glance, tall and pale, wearing clothes that seemed slightly out of place. But something about its movements was wrong. It walked too smoothly, never quite making the same sounds as the other people in the corridor. Its eyes, when it turned to look at her, reflected light in a way that human eyes simply didn't. The figure approached the information desk where Rebecca was stationed, moving with that unnaturally fluid gait. When it spoke, asking for directions to the cardiac unit, its voice was perfectly human but somehow hollow, as if the words were being generated rather than spoken. Rebecca gave the directions, fighting every instinct that told her something was fundamentally wrong with this person. The figure thanked her and walked away, disappearing around a corner. When Rebecca checked the security cameras later, there was no record of anyone matching that description entering or leaving the building. These encounters were happening everywhere. Office workers reported colleagues who seemed familiar but weren't quite right, speaking in conversations that felt scripted and rehearsed. Shopkeepers described customers who paid with exact change and never seemed to blink. Children told their parents about new friends at school, who knew things they shouldn't know, and asked questions that made no sense. In each case, the witnesses were left with the same unsettling feeling that they had been studied, catalogued, and filed away for some unknown purpose. The pattern was becoming clear to those who were paying attention. The beings were conducting a systematic survey of human society, learning our behaviors, our routines, our weaknesses. They were preparing for something, and that preparation was accelerating. Military installations worldwide began reporting unprecedented security breaches. Not physical intrusions, but something far more sophisticated. Classified databases were being accessed without any trace of how the security had been bypassed. Surveillance systems captured footage of empty corridors, while motion sensors registered movement that shouldn't have been there. It was as if the installations were being mapped by invisible observers who could manipulate technology at will. Colonel David Hayes was overseeing security at a classified research facility when the infiltrations began at his location. The facility housed experimental aircraft and advanced weapons systems, all protected by multiple layers of electronic and physical security. Yet somehow, someone or something was gaining access to areas that should have been impossible to reach. The security log showed normal readings. The cameras revealed nothing unusual, but sensitive documents were being photographed and classified materials examined by unknown entities. Hayes ordered a complete lockdown and brought in additional personnel to conduct a thorough search. What they found defied explanation. In a sealed laboratory that required multiple clearances to access, they discovered evidence that someone had been there recently. Not footprints or fingerprints, but something more subtle. Equipment had been moved microscopic distances. Computer terminals showed signs of recent use despite being logged as inactive. Most disturbing of all, some of the experimental technology showed wear patterns suggesting it had been operated by someone who understood its function better than the engineers who designed it. The implications were terrifying. These beings weren't just observing human technology, they were studying it, learning from it, and potentially improving upon it. The gap between human and alien capability, already vast, was growing wider with each passing day. But perhaps the most chilling encounters were those reported by individuals who claimed direct communication with the entities. Dr. Michael Torres, a linguist specializing in pattern recognition, was contacted by what he initially believed to be a research colleague. The messages came through encrypted channels, discussing linguistic structures and communication theories with a sophistication that impressed even Torres. It wasn't until weeks into the correspondence that he realized his contact was discussing languages that didn't exist and communication methods that hadn't been invented. When Torres tried to trace the source of the messages, he found they originated from locations that changed constantly, sometimes appearing to come from facilities that didn't exist or coordinates in the middle of empty ocean. The entity, for that's what he had come to believe it was, seemed amused by his attempts to identify it. In their final exchange, it thanked him for his insights into human communication and mentioned that the information would be useful for the coming convergence. The convergence. The term appeared in reports from around the world, whispered by witnesses who claimed contact with the beings. Some described it as an awakening, others as a transformation. A few spoke of it with hope, but most with profound unease. Whatever it meant, the beings were working toward it with methodical precision. The evidence was mounting that humanity was being prepared for something momentous. The question was no longer whether these beings existed or what they wanted. The question was whether humanity would be ready for what was coming, and whether we would have any choice in the matter when it arrived. The Watchers had been patient, but their patience was reaching its end. The convergence nears. I was dispatched to a remote military facility in the Nevada desert on what started as a routine security assessment. The brass hadn't given us much detail, just coordinates and orders to investigate unusual electromagnetic readings that had been disrupting communications across a 50-mile radius. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about our place in the universe. The base was older than most classified installations, built into the desert floor with concrete bunkers that disappeared into the earth like concrete roots. As our convoy approached the main gate, I noticed something immediately unsettling. The air itself felt different, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up and created an odd, metallic taste in my mouth. Colonel Hayes, the base commander, met us at the entrance. His face was drawn tight with exhaustion, and his eyes held the kind of weight that comes from seeing things that challenge your fundamental understanding of reality. He led us through a series of security checkpoints, each one more heavily fortified than the last, until we reached the heart of the facility. "What you're about to see," Hayes said, as we stopped before a massive steel door marked only with symbols I didn't recognize, "has been contained here for the past 18 months. We've lost contact with 3 research teams, and our instruments are picking up energy signatures that shouldn't exist according to any known physics." The door opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a circular chamber carved directly into the bedrock. In the center sat an object that defied description. It was roughly spherical, about 12 feet in diameter, but its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury while maintaining perfect geometric stability. Patterns of light pulsed across its surface in rhythms that felt almost organic, like watching the heartbeat of something vast and alien. "We found it buried 300 feet down during a routine excavation," Hayes explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carbon dating suggests it's been here for at least 10,000 years, but the energy output has been increasing exponentially over the past 6 months. As I watched, the object's pulsing intensified, and I felt that same pressure in my head that so many others had described in their encounters. It wasn't painful, but it was unmistakably foreign, like having thoughts that weren't quite your own pressing at the edges of consciousness. That's when I understood. All the reports I'd been reading, all the accounts of strange encounters and impossible sightings, they were connected to this. The object wasn't just some ancient artifact. It was a beacon, and it had been calling to its creators for millennia. "Sir," one of the technicians said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "the energy readings are spiking again. We're detecting multiple objects moving in the upper atmosphere." Through the facility's observation windows, we could see them. Dozens of lights moving in perfect formation across the night sky, no longer hiding, no longer subtle. They moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of intelligence far beyond our own. The convergence that the Watchers had been preparing for was finally beginning. Everything that had happened before, every sighting and encounter, every moment of strange technology and impossible physics, had been leading to this moment. They were coming home, and they were bringing others with them. The question that haunted me as I watched those lights descend wasn't whether humanity was ready for first contact. It was whether we had passed whatever test they had been conducting all these years, or if our time as the dominant species on this planet was about to come to an end. The object in the chamber pulsed one final time, its light brightening to an almost blinding intensity, and then fell silent. In that moment of absolute quiet, I could feel it in my bones. The waiting was over. The evaluation was complete, and whatever came next would reshape everything we thought we knew about our place in the cosmos. The convergence had begun, and there was no turning back. The scattered accounts and testimonies have reached a crescendo, revealing disturbing patterns that suggest we are witnessing something far beyond isolated incidents. The tall ones, the watchers, these pale sentinels of unknown origin have been systematically documenting our world through means we barely comprehend. From the depths of Antarctic ice to the heights of our skies, from rural pharmacies to city streets, they observe, catalog, and prepare. The evidence is undeniable. Electronic systems failing in precise patterns. Time distortions that leave gaps in our memories and recordings. Underground chambers filled with technology that responds to human presence. Wildlife behaving with unnatural coordination, as if receiving instructions from an unseen source. And always, always, that sense of being watched by intelligence that operates beyond our understanding. What emerges from these testimonies is not random contact, but systematic evaluation. The geometric formations appearing across landscapes worldwide, the thermal signatures that reveal hidden structures beneath our feet, the way animals suddenly abandon familiar territories, guided by instincts we cannot fathom. These are not coincidences but components of a vast intelligence-gathering operation that has been ongoing for decades, perhaps centuries. The most chilling aspect is how they adapt. Early encounters showed crude attempts at communication, awkward mimicry of human behavior. Recent reports describe sophisticated manipulation of our technology, seamless integration with our digital infrastructure, and an understanding of human psychology that borders on complete. They are learning, evolving, preparing for something that approaches with each passing day. The convergence patterns are accelerating. Multiple witnesses report the same timeline, the same sense of urgency in their encounters. The beings speak of balance, of preparation, of a coming change that will require humanity to prove its readiness. Their messages, encoded in landscapes and transmitted through electromagnetic disturbances, all point toward the same inevitable conclusion. Contact is no longer a question of if, but when. Those who have encountered them directly describe a fundamental alteration in their perception of reality. The boundaries between what we consider possible and impossible blur when faced with intelligence that operates according to principles we have yet to discover. Yet beneath the fear and uncertainty lies something else, a recognition that we are not alone in the universe, and that our cosmic neighbors have been watching, waiting, and preparing for the moment when our species is ready to take its place among the stars. The question that haunts every testimony, every unexplained encounter, every moment of missing time, is simple yet profound. Are we ready for what comes next? The watchers seem to believe that moment of judgment approaches rapidly. Their increased activity, their growing boldness, their systematic preparation of our world for something unprecedented, all suggest that the long period of observation is nearing its end. What follows will determine not just the future of human civilization, but our understanding of consciousness, reality, and our place in a universe far stranger and more populated than we ever dared imagine. The testimonies continue to arrive, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that, when complete, will reveal the true nature of the intelligence that has been guiding our species toward this crucial moment in cosmic history. The watchers have become the watched, and soon we may discover that we were never the observers we believed ourselves to be, but subjects in an experiment whose conclusion approaches with each passing day. I was working late at the office, just me and the security guard downstairs. The building was one of those newer corporate complexes on the edge of town, all glass and steel with those motion sensor lights that flickered on as you walked past. I'd been pulling long hours on a project that was due the next morning, and by the time I looked up from my computer it was well past midnight. The floor was dead quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional ping from someone's computer getting an email. I was gathering my things when I noticed something odd through the window. There was this faint, pulsing light coming from the parking garage across the street. Not like headlights or the usual security lighting, but something softer, more rhythmic. At first, I thought it might be a maintenance crew working late, but the light had this strange quality to it. It would brighten slowly, hold for a few seconds, then fade almost to nothing before starting the cycle again. The pattern was too regular to be random, too deliberate to be a malfunction. I found myself standing at the window, watching this light pulse in the darkness. There was something hypnotic about it, like watching waves roll in at the beach. But as I watched, I started to feel uneasy. The building across the street was supposed to be empty. The company that leased it had moved out months ago, and the 4 rent signs were still up in the lobby windows. I grabbed my phone and tried to get a video of the light, but the camera couldn't seem to focus properly. The image kept shifting between too bright and too dark, never quite capturing what I was seeing with my own eyes. When I lowered the phone, the light was still there, steady as before. That's when I noticed my computer screen flickering. Just slight variations in brightness, but they seemed to match the rhythm of the light outside. I checked the other monitors on the floor, and they were all doing the same thing. A synchronized pulse that shouldn't have been possible. I called down to the security desk, but Jerry didn't answer. That was unusual because he always picked up on the first ring. I tried his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The silence in the building felt heavier now, like the air pressure had changed. The light across the street began to pulse faster. Not dramatically, but noticeably quicker than before. And as it did, I started hearing this low humming sound. It wasn't coming from the air conditioning or any of the office equipment. It seemed to emanate from the building itself, like the structure was resonating with some frequency I couldn't identify. I decided it was time to leave. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to be alone in the building anymore. I packed up quickly and headed for the elevator, but when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The indicator lights were dark, and there was no sound of machinery moving. The stairwell was my only option. As I pushed open the heavy door, the humming sound grew louder. It echoed off the concrete walls, creating this strange harmonic that made my teeth ache. I started down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, but by the 3rd floor, I had to stop. The light from outside was now visible through the stairwell windows, and it was much brighter than before. Bright enough that it cast shadows on the walls as it pulsed. But these weren't normal shadows. They moved independently of the light source, twisting and shifting in ways that defied physics. When I reached the ground floor, Jerry's security desk was empty. His coffee was still warm, his newspaper open to the sports section, but no sign of him anywhere. The front doors were locked from the inside, which meant he had to be somewhere in the building. But where? The light outside had stopped pulsing. It now glowed with a steady, intense brightness that made the parking garage look like it was filled with fog. I could see shapes moving in that light, silhouettes that didn't quite look human. They moved too smoothly, too purposefully, like they were gliding rather than walking. I tried the emergency exit, but the alarm didn't sound when I pushed the bar. The door opened silently into the night air, which felt thick and charged, like before a thunderstorm. The humming was everywhere now, not just in the building but in the air itself. As I stepped outside, the light across the street began to fade. Not gradually, but in sections, like someone was turning off switches in a specific sequence. Within minutes, the parking garage was dark again, and the humming had stopped. The only sound was the distant traffic on the highway and the normal buzz of the city at night. I never found out what happened to Jerry. When I came back the next day, he was at his desk like always, reading his paper and drinking coffee. But when I asked him about the night before, he looked at me like I was crazy. Said he'd been there all night, nothing unusual happened. The security footage from that evening was corrupted, just static and digital noise. I still work in that building, but I don't stay late anymore. And sometimes, when I'm leaving at a normal hour, I'll glance across the street at that parking garage. Most of the time it's just dark and empty like it should be. But every now and then, I catch a glimpse of that soft, pulsing light starting up again, and I walk a little faster to my car. The strange thing is, I've started having dreams about that night. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid dreams where I'm back in the stairwell, watching those impossible shadows move across the walls. And in the dreams, I don't run. I walk toward the light instead, drawn by that humming sound that seems to promise answers to questions I didn't know I had. I've never told anyone about that night, not completely. Who would believe it? But sometimes I wonder if Jerry remembers more than he lets on. Sometimes I catch him staring out the window toward that empty building, and there's something in his expression that suggests he knows exactly what I'm thinking about. The building management says the space across the street is still vacant. Has been for over a year now, but I've seen lights in the windows during the day sometimes, just brief flashes that could be reflections or could be something else entirely. And late at night when I'm driving past on my way home, I swear I can still hear that humming sound, faint but persistent, like a frequency that never quite goes away. You find yourself in the aftermath of something monumental, something that defies every rational explanation you've ever relied upon. The evidence is overwhelming now, a cascade of encounters that have built to this moment of undeniable truth. You've witnessed the lights that dance beyond earthly physics, felt the presence of minds that operate on frequencies your species is only beginning to detect. The patterns are clear to those willing to see them. The beings have been here far longer than your recorded history suggests. They've walked among your ancestors, guided civilizations, and watched as your kind struggled toward consciousness. What you're experiencing now isn't invasion or conquest, it's evaluation. They're determining whether humanity has reached the threshold necessary for open contact, or if you remain too primitive, too dangerous to yourselves and others. Every unexplained sighting, every moment of missing time, every impossible craft witnessed by credible observers, these aren't random occurrences. They're deliberate, calculated, part of a vast assessment protocol that spans generations. The pilots, the farmers, the night shift workers, the hikers in remote forests, you've all been participants in the largest psychological and sociological study ever conducted on Earth. The technology you've glimpsed operates on principles that make your current understanding of physics look like cave paintings. Consciousness itself becomes a tool, a medium through which they navigate not just space, but the fabric of reality. The strange effects on electronics, the way time seems to bend around their presence, the telepathic impressions that flood witnesses' minds. These aren't side effects. They're features of a science so advanced it appears as magic to your limited perspective. But here's what should terrify and inspire you in equal measure. The evaluation period is ending. The scattered encounters, the gradual revelation, the slow conditioning of your species. It's all been preparation for a decision that's approaching faster than most realize. The signs are accelerating. The witnesses are multiplying. The evidence is becoming impossible to suppress or explain away. They're not waiting for your governments to disclose their existence. They're not concerned with your political systems or religious institutions. They're preparing for direct contact with individuals who've demonstrated the capacity to handle the truth. The chosen ones aren't world leaders or celebrities. They're the ordinary people who've encountered them and remained stable, who've processed the impossible and emerged stronger. You're living through the final phase of humanity's childhood. What comes next will fundamentally alter everything you believe about your place in the universe, your purpose as a species, and the true nature of consciousness itself. The question isn't whether contact will happen, it's whether humanity will pass the test that's already underway. The Watchers have been patient. They've observed your wars, your environmental destruction, your capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Now they're deciding, are you ready to join the larger community of conscious beings that spans the cosmos, or do you need more time to evolve? The answer may come sooner than you think, and it won't arrive through official channels. It will come in the quiet moments, in the spaces between certainty and doubt, when the veil finally lifts and you realize you were never alone. You were never abandoned. You were always being prepared for this moment when two forms of consciousness would finally meet as equals, and the real story of humanity's place in the universe could finally begin. The question now isn't whether you believe. The question is whether you're ready for what belief demands of you. Because once you accept the truth of what's happening, once you acknowledge the reality of their presence, there's no going back to the comfortable illusion of cosmic solitude. You become part of something larger, something that transcends the boundaries of your small world and connects you to the infinite mystery that surrounds us all. The choice, as it always has been, remains yours. But the time for choosing is running out. As we've seen throughout these accounts, the pattern of escalating contact continues to unfold across every corner of our world. But what happens when these encounters move beyond simple observation? What occurs when the boundaries between watcher and watched begin to dissolve entirely? The accounts that follow represent some of the most profound and unsettling testimonies we've gathered. These are stories of direct intervention, of lives fundamentally altered by contact with intelligences that operate by rules we're only beginning to glimpse. They speak to a reality where the veil between worlds has grown thin, where the presence of the Watchers has become impossible to ignore. Dr. Sarah Chen was conducting atmospheric research in the remote mountains of Colorado when her life changed forever. As a climatologist with over 15 years of experience, she'd spent countless nights alone in research stations, monitoring equipment and recording data. She was accustomed to isolation, to the profound silence that settles over high-altitude locations after dark. But on this particular evening in late October, that familiar silence would be broken by something that defied every scientific principle she held dear. The research station was positioned at nearly 11,000 feet, a small prefabricated structure housing sensitive atmospheric monitoring equipment. Sarah had been there for 3 days, part of a larger study examining climate patterns in the Rocky Mountain region. The work was routine but important, requiring someone to remain on site to calibrate instruments and ensure continuous data collection. It was just past midnight when the first anomaly occurred. Sarah was reviewing data logs on her laptop when every piece of electronic equipment in the station began malfunctioning simultaneously. The atmospheric sensors started displaying impossible readings, temperature gauges fluctuated wildly, and the radio communication system erupted in static. Most disturbing of all, her laptop screen began displaying information she had never input. Lines of text appeared in a language she didn't recognize. symbols that seemed to shift and change as she watched them. The characters weren't random gibberish, but clearly organized, structured like mathematical equations or scientific formulas. As someone with advanced degrees in physics and atmospheric science, Sarah could recognize patterns even when she couldn't understand their meaning. These symbols suggested complex calculations, theories that pushed the boundaries of known science. She tried to document what was happening, grabbing her camera to photograph the screen, but the device wouldn't function. Every time she attempted to capture an image, the camera would shut down or display error messages. It was as if something was actively preventing her from recording evidence of what she was witnessing. The temperature inside the station began dropping rapidly. Despite the heating system running at full capacity, the air grew so cold that her breath became visible. Ice crystals started forming on the windows from the inside, creating intricate patterns that looked almost deliberately designed. The formations weren't random frost, but geometric shapes that reminded her of the symbols appearing on her computer screen. Then came the light. A soft, pulsing glow began emanating from somewhere outside the station. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but had an otherworldly quality that made her skin tingle. The light seemed to penetrate the walls themselves, casting no shadows but illuminating everything with an even, pearl-like radiance. Sarah approached the window cautiously, her scientific curiosity overriding her growing fear. What she saw outside challenged everything she understood about physics and reality. Floating approximately 50 feet from the station was a structure that defied description. It wasn't solid in any conventional sense, but appeared to be made of crystallized light, its surface constantly shifting between transparent and opaque. The object was roughly spherical but with faceted surfaces that caught and reflected the starlight in impossible ways. As she watched, transfixed, the structure began communicating with her. Not through sound or visible signals, but directly into her consciousness. Information flooded her mind, concepts and theories about atmospheric manipulation, climate control technologies that were centuries beyond current human capability. She understood, without knowing how, that she was being shown solutions to problems her research team had been struggling with for years. The communication wasn't invasive or frightening. Instead, it felt like a gentle sharing of knowledge, as if she were being invited to participate in a vast cosmic classroom. The beings responsible for this contact made it clear that Earth's climate systems were more fragile than human science had realized, but they also provided insights into how these systems could be stabilized and protected. For nearly 3 hours, this exchange continued. Sarah found herself understanding atmospheric dynamics at a level that seemed impossible, grasping connections between solar radiation, magnetic fields, and weather patterns that would have taken years of research to discover through conventional means. The knowledge wasn't forced upon her, but offered freely, with the understanding that she could choose what to accept and what to reject. As dawn approached, the communication gradually faded. The crystalline structure outside began to dissolve, its light dimming until it was indistinguishable from the morning sky. The electronic equipment in the station returned to normal function, and the temperature stabilized. But the knowledge remained, burning bright in Sarah's consciousness like a flame that could never be extinguished. In the days that followed, Sarah struggled with what to do with this information. The scientific insights she had received were profound, potentially revolutionary for climate research. But how could she explain their source? How could she publish findings based on an encounter that violated every principle of scientific methodology? She began incorporating the new understanding into her work gradually, presenting discoveries as the result of innovative analysis techniques and novel theoretical approaches. Her research took on a new depth and accuracy that impressed colleagues and led to significant breakthroughs in atmospheric modeling. But Sarah knew the truth. and with that knowledge came a burden of responsibility she had never anticipated. The beings had made it clear that they were monitoring Earth's environmental systems closely, concerned about the trajectory of climate change and its potential impact not just on human civilization, but on the planet's role in a larger cosmic ecosystem. They weren't interested in direct intervention, but were willing to share knowledge with individuals who could use it responsibly. Sarah's encounter represents a new phase in the pattern of contact we've been documenting. These aren't random abductions or brief sightings, but deliberate knowledge transfers, attempts to prepare humanity for challenges that require solutions beyond our current scientific understanding. The Watchers are no longer content to simply observe. They're beginning to teach. But such profound contact comes with consequences that extend far beyond individual experience. Dr. Marcus Webb discovered this when his life was forever altered by an encounter that began as routine archaeological fieldwork and ended with him questioning the very foundations of human history. Marcus had been excavating a site in the Atacama Desert of Chile, investigating what appeared to be pre-Columbian settlements that didn't match any known cultural patterns. The artifacts his team had uncovered were puzzling, showing technological sophistication that seemed anachronistic for the presumed time period. Metal alloys that shouldn't have existed, precision-carved stones that would have required advanced tools, and artwork depicting celestial events with astronomical accuracy that predated known observational techniques. It was during the third week of excavation that Marcus made the discovery that would change everything. While examining a partially exposed structure, he noticed that certain stone blocks contained embedded materials that looked distinctly non-terrestrial. The metals had an unusual luster and displayed properties that defied conventional analysis. When subjected to spectroscopic examination, they revealed elemental compositions that included isotopes not naturally occurring on Earth. That night, as Marcus was documenting his findings in his field tent, the desert around him began to change. The familiar sounds of nocturnal wildlife gradually faded, replaced by a deep, resonant humming that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The air grew thick and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, but the sky remained clear and star-filled. The humming intensified, and Marcus noticed that the artifacts in his tent were beginning to resonate in response. The strange metals vibrated at frequencies that created haunting musical tones. It was as if the objects were awakening, responding to some distant call that only they could hear. Outside his tent, the desert landscape was transforming. The excavation site, which had been a collection of scattered ruins and partially exposed structures, was now revealed in its complete form. Buildings rose from the sand, their surfaces glowing with the same ethereal light that Marcus was learning to associate with otherworldly presence. The settlement wasn't ancient at all, or rather, it existed in a state that transcended normal concepts of time. Figures moved among the structures, tall and graceful beings whose forms seemed to shift between solid matter and pure energy. They went about their activities with purposeful calm, tending to devices and technologies that Marcus couldn't begin to comprehend. It was like watching a city that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with only portions visible to human perception. One of the beings approached Marcus, its presence both alien and strangely familiar. Through direct consciousness transfer, it began explaining the true history of the site. This wasn't a human settlement, but an ancient monitoring station, one of many established across Earth thousands of years ago. The purpose was observation and occasional intervention, ensuring that human development proceeded along certain critical pathways. The artifacts Marcus had been studying weren't remnants of a lost civilization, but active components of a vast surveillance network. The strange metals were crystallized technology, capable of recording and transmitting information across interstellar distances. For millennia, these devices had been documenting human progress, sending reports to distant worlds about Earth's readiness for broader cosmic contact. Marcus learned that humanity was approaching a crucial threshold, a point where decisions made in the coming decades would determine not just the survival of human civilization, but its eligibility for membership in a galactic community. The monitoring stations had been recording evidence of human potential, both positive and negative, compiling a comprehensive assessment that would influence this cosmic judgment. The revelation was overwhelming. Marcus realized that human history had been shaped by subtle interventions, guidance provided at critical moments to prevent catastrophic mistakes while still allowing for natural development. The rise and fall of civilizations, technological breakthroughs, even individual discoveries had sometimes been influenced by this ancient network of watchers. But the most disturbing aspect of the communication was the urgency it conveyed. The monitoring period was ending. Soon, humanity would face challenges that would test every aspect of its character and capabilities. The decisions made during this trial period would determine Earth's future relationship with the broader universe. As dawn broke over the desert, the vision faded. The glowing structures receded back into the sand, and the beings vanished like morning mist. But the artifacts remained, and Marcus now understood their true significance. He was no longer just an archaeologist, but a keeper of cosmic secrets, burdened with knowledge that could reshape human understanding of our place in the universe. The weight of this responsibility has followed Marcus ever since. How do you publish archaeological findings that suggest human civilization has been under extraterrestrial observation for thousands of years? How do you present evidence that our planet is part of a vast cosmic community without causing panic or disbelief? Like Sarah, Marcus has chosen to introduce his discoveries gradually, framing them in ways that academic colleagues can accept while slowly expanding the boundaries of what's considered possible. But both researchers know they're part of something much larger, participants in a careful process of disclosure that's preparing humanity for revelations that will fundamentally alter our understanding of reality. These encounters with the Watchers are becoming more frequent and more direct. The age of passive observation is ending, replaced by active engagement with individuals who have demonstrated the wisdom and stability to handle transformative knowledge. But as more people experience these profound contacts, the question becomes not whether humanity will learn the truth about our cosmic situation, but whether we're ready for the responsibilities that come with such knowledge. The pattern continues to escalate, and with each new account it becomes clearer that we're approaching a moment of unprecedented change. The Watchers are no longer content to remain hidden. They're preparing us, one encounter at a time, for a future that will challenge everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the infinite expanse of existence. The corridors seem to stretch endlessly beneath the research facility. What started as a routine overnight security shift had turned into something far more unsettling. The emergency lighting cast long shadows that moved independently of any source, and the air carried a metallic taste that made my mouth feel dry. I had been walking these halls for 3 hours, checking each door, each window, following protocols that suddenly felt inadequate. The facility studied atmospheric anomalies, or so the paperwork claimed. Most of us guards weren't given details about the actual research, just told to monitor the perimeter and report anything unusual. That night, unusual didn't begin to cover it. The first sign something was wrong came through the radio. Static filled the channel where clear communication should have been, but within that static, patterns emerged. Not random interference, but deliberate sequences of sound that felt almost like language. I tried switching frequencies, but every channel carried the same structured noise. Then the temperature began to drop. Not gradually, but in pockets throughout the building. I'd walk from a normal 70-degree hallway into a section where my breath formed clouds. The heating system showed no malfunctions, no broken pipes or faulty thermostats. The cold simply existed where it chose to exist. As I continued my rounds, I noticed the security cameras were tracking movement that wasn't there. On the monitors, I could see the lenses slowly panning across empty rooms, following something invisible. When I checked those same rooms in person, they were vacant, undisturbed. But the cameras insisted otherwise. The facility's main laboratory sat at the center of the complex, behind reinforced doors that required special clearance. I'd never been inside, but that night those doors stood open. The lock mechanism showed no signs of tampering, no override codes in the system logs. They had simply opened. Inside, the lab equipment hummed with activity despite being unmanned. Monitors displayed data streams in languages I didn't recognize, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. In the center of the room, a containment unit that should have been empty cast shadows that moved independently of the overhead lights. I felt a presence before I saw anything. Not threatening exactly, but intensely curious, like being studied by something with capabilities far beyond my understanding. The sensation came in waves, growing stronger as I moved deeper into the laboratory. The radio crackled again, but this time the patterns in the static resolved into something almost comprehensible. Not words, but concepts pressed directly into my consciousness. Images of vast distances, of observers from places where the rules of physics bent in ways that defied explanation. I understood then that the facility wasn't studying atmospheric anomalies. It was monitoring visitors who had been watching us far longer than we had been watching for them. The research wasn't about natural phenomena, but about contact with intelligences that existed in the spaces between our understanding. The presence grew stronger, more focused. I felt examined, catalogued, but not with malice. More like a scientist studying a new species, careful not to disturb but intensely interested in every detail. The temperature around me stabilized, the static cleared, and for a moment everything felt perfectly normal. Then it was gone. The equipment powered down, the doors sealed themselves, and the building returned to its usual quiet. My radio worked normally, the cameras tracked only what was actually there, and the heating system resumed its regular operation. In my final report, I wrote about equipment malfunctions and atmospheric pressure changes. The official log showed nothing unusual, no unauthorized access, no system anomalies. But I knew what I had experienced, and I knew it wasn't the first time. The facility continued its work, monitoring and documenting visits from observers who remained just beyond our ability to fully comprehend. The research teams came and went, studying data they could never quite explain, while the real subjects of their investigation continued their patient, methodical study of us. Some nights, when the air grows still and the familiar world feels suddenly fragile, I remember that presence and wonder what conclusions they reached about humanity. Whether we passed some test we didn't know we were taking, or if we're simply one more entry in a catalog of civilizations they've encountered across the vast emptiness between stars. The facility still operates, its true purpose hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and misdirection. But those of us who worked there understand that we were never the observers. We were always the observed, studied by minds that measure time in geological epochs and view our entire species as a brief, fascinating moment in the cosmic story they're writing. As the ancient mechanisms continue their endless surveillance and the watchers maintain their vigil over humanity's evolutionary threshold, a new phase of contact emerges, one that will test the very foundations of human consciousness and our readiness for cosmic integration. I never thought retirement would bring me face to face with the impossible. After 43 years as a commercial airline pilot, I'd seen everything the skies had to offer, or so I believed. My final flight was supposed to be routine, a simple passenger run from Denver to Phoenix, nothing more than a ceremonial goodbye to the career that had defined my life. But what happened during those last hours in the cockpit changed everything I thought I knew about our place in the universe. The weather was perfect that evening, clear skies stretching endlessly in every direction. I remember feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as we reached cruising altitude, the familiar hum of the engines providing a comforting backdrop to what I knew would be my last dance with the clouds. My co-pilot, Sarah, was handling most of the routine communications, leaving me free to simply absorb the moment and reflect on 4 decades of flight time. That's when the radio began acting strangely. It started with subtle interference, a barely perceptible static that seemed to pulse with an almost musical rhythm. Sarah noticed it too, her brow furrowing as she adjusted the frequency settings. But instead of clearing up, the interference grew stronger, transforming from random noise into something that sounded almost like a language. Complex tonal patterns that seemed to carry meaning just beyond our comprehension. Then we saw them. 3 objects appeared off our starboard wing, maintaining perfect formation with our aircraft. They weren't like anything in our air traffic control systems. No transponder signals, no radio chatter, nothing on radar. They moved with an fluid grace that defied conventional aerodynamics, shifting positions around us in intricate patterns that seemed both purposeful and elegant. The radio interference intensified, and suddenly the sounds resolved into something unmistakably communicative. It wasn't English or any human language, but somehow we both understood the essence of what was being conveyed. These beings had been watching, waiting for the right moment to make contact, and they had chosen my final flight as that moment. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the emergency protocols, but I placed a gentle hand on her arm. Something in the quality of the communication told me this wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. The beings were extending an offer, not just to us, but to humanity itself. They spoke of cosmic communities, of civilizations that had successfully navigated the challenges we now faced, and of the choice that lay before our species. Through the strange telepathic connection that had formed, I learned that human consciousness was approaching a critical threshold. The technological advancement, the environmental challenges, the social upheavals, all of it was part of a natural, evolutionary process that every sentient species must navigate. We could choose to transcend our limitations and join the greater cosmic community, or we could remain isolated, struggling with the same destructive patterns that had plagued us for millennia. The beings showed me visions of what lay ahead, not through words, but through direct transmission of understanding. I saw human settlements among the stars, technologies that could heal our planet, and forms of consciousness that expanded far beyond our current limitations. But I also saw the price of such advancement, the need to release our attachment to fear, competition, and the illusion of separation that had defined human civilization for so long. As my final flight drew to a close and we began our descent into Phoenix, the objects gradually faded from view, but the connection remained. The beings left me with a message to share. Humanity stands at a crossroads, and the choices we make in the coming years will determine not just our survival, but our potential for cosmic citizenship. The radio interference cleared completely as we touched down, leaving only the normal sounds of air traffic control and ground crew communications. Sarah and I filed our report, though we both knew how it would be received. Another unexplained aerial phenomenon, another story that would be quietly buried in classified files. But the message remains, echoing in my mind with crystal clarity. The Watchers have been preparing us, testing our readiness through countless encounters over decades. The strange sightings, the unexplained phenomena, the gradual disclosure of their presence. All of it has been leading to this moment of choice. As I write this, months after hanging up my captain's wings for the final time, I can still feel their presence at the edges of consciousness. They're waiting patiently, understanding that such a monumental decision cannot be rushed, but they've made it clear that the window for this transition won't remain open indefinitely. Cosmic evolution operates on scales beyond human timekeeping, and there are natural rhythms that must be honored. The question now is not whether we're alone in the universe. We never were. The question is whether we're ready to step beyond the limitations of our current existence and embrace our role as conscious participants in something far greater than ourselves. The Watchers have shown us the path, but the choice to walk it must be ours alone. In quiet moments, when the sky is clear and the stars shine bright, I sometimes catch glimpses of movement at the edge of vision, shadows that dart between clouds, lights that pulse with familiar rhythms. They're still there, still watching, still waiting, and in those moments I understand that my final flight wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of humanity's greatest journey. By now, the signs were impossible to ignore. The scattered incidents, the isolated encounters, the growing frequency of the inexplicable, they were all part of something much larger unfolding. Those who had experienced the presence of the Watchers began to understand that everything was converging toward a single, inevitable moment. Dr. Sarah Chen had been monitoring electromagnetic anomalies for 3 decades, but the readings from the past 6 months defied every scientific model she knew. The patterns weren't random. They formed a precise mathematical sequence that seemed to pulse with intentional rhythm. Each spike in the data corresponded exactly with reported sightings around the globe, as if the entire planet was being systematically scanned and evaluated. "The frequency is accelerating," she told her research partner, Dr. Marcus Webb, as they studied the latest data streams. "Whatever's been observing us, it's moving into the next phase." Webb nodded grimly, pointing to a cluster of readings from the past week. "Look at this. Simultaneous activity on 6 continents. This isn't random anymore. This is coordinated." What they didn't know was that thousands of miles away, in a small farming community in Iowa, the Henderson family was experiencing their own confirmation that something monumental was approaching. For 3 nights running, their cattle had arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns in the pasture. Circles, triangles, and formations that seemed to mirror the star charts their daughter Emma had been obsessively drawing since her encounter 6 months prior. Emma's drawings had evolved from simple sketches to complex diagrams filled with symbols she couldn't explain but somehow understood. When her father asked her what they meant, she would only say, "They're getting ready. They want us to be ready too." The preparation wasn't limited to rural communities. In major cities worldwide, sensitive individuals reported the same recurring dream. Standing in vast halls filled with soft blue light, surrounded by tall, luminescent figures who communicated without words. The dreams always ended the same way, with the understanding that a choice was coming, and humanity would need to decide its own fate. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, now retired from his military service, had become an unofficial coordinator for former military personnel who had encountered the phenomena. His secure communication network buzzed with reports from across the globe. Commercial pilots reporting synchronized light formations, naval officers documenting underwater anomalies that moved with impossible precision, and radar operators tracking objects that seemed to phase in and out of existence at will. "The pattern is clear," Mitchell explained during an encrypted video conference with his network. "They've been studying us, testing our responses, evaluating our readiness. Every encounter has been carefully orchestrated to gauge how we react to the unknown. One of the participants, a former Air Force pilot named Captain Lisa Rodriguez, shared her recent experience. "I was flying a commercial route last week when air traffic control lost contact with our flight for exactly 17 minutes. From our perspective, nothing happened. But when we landed, the airport log showed we had simply vanished from all tracking systems. No radar signature, no radio contact, nothing. Then we reappeared exactly where we should have been." Similar temporal anomalies were being reported with increasing frequency. Entire neighborhoods would experience synchronized power outages that lasted precisely the same duration. Digital clocks would reset to the same time across vast distances. Surveillance cameras would show empty spaces where, moments before, witnesses had observed strange lights or unusual phenomena. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the anthropologist who had first documented the ancient connection between human civilizations and the Watchers, made a disturbing discovery while researching in the archives of the Vatican. Hidden within texts that predated Christianity, she found references to the Great Convergence, a time when the sky dwellers would return to offer humanity a choice between transcendence and stagnation. The texts described signs that matched exactly what was happening now: the awakening of dormant abilities in certain individuals, the acceleration of technological understanding, and the emergence of a global consciousness that would either unite humanity or reveal its fundamental divisions. According to these sources, Dr. Vasquez explained to a gathering of researchers and experiencers, this isn't the first time this has happened. Throughout history, at critical moments in human development, the Watchers have presented civilizations with the same choice. Some accepted the guidance and evolved beyond our current understanding. Others rejected it and simply faded from history. The weight of this revelation settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They were not just witnessing random extraterrestrial contact. They were participants in a cosmic evaluation that had been building for millennia. In remote locations around the world, massive structures began to emerge from the Earth. Not alien ships or technologies, but ancient constructions that had been dormant for thousands of years. Each structure bore the same geometric patterns that experiencers had been seeing in their visions, and each one began to emit a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate with the planet itself. The structures appeared simultaneously across every continent, always in areas far from major population centers, but close enough that their presence could not be ignored. Satellite imagery showed that they formed a precise geometric pattern when viewed from orbit, a global network of some kind, activating after eons of dormancy. Government agencies worldwide scrambled to investigate, but every attempt to approach the structures resulted in the same phenomenon. Electronics would fail, personnel would experience missing time, and detailed memories of the encounters would fade within hours. Only vague impressions remained, of being observed, evaluated, and ultimately deemed either ready or unready for what was to come. Among those who had been in direct contact with the Watchers, a new understanding began to emerge. The encounters had never been random. Each person had been selected for specific qualities: empathy, curiosity, resilience, the ability to adapt to paradigm-shifting revelations without losing their essential humanity. Maria Santos, the single mother who had accepted the alien presence into her consciousness, found herself able to communicate with others who had undergone similar transformations. The communication happened without technology, through direct mental connection that transcended language and distance. "We're becoming something new," she realized during one of these mental conferences. "Not less human, but more than human. They're not trying to replace us. They're trying to help us evolve." The revelation spread through the network of contactees like wildfire. The Watchers weren't invaders or conquerors. They were gardeners, tending to the development of consciousness throughout the galaxy. Earth was one of many worlds they had been nurturing, and humanity had reached the crucial point where it could either join the galactic community or remain isolated in its current state of development. But the choice wasn't being made by governments or leaders. It was being made by individuals, one person at a time, as they encountered the reality of what lay beyond their previous understanding of existence. The acceleration continued. People reported spontaneous telepathic experiences, sudden insights into complex scientific problems, and an overwhelming sense of connection to something vast and benevolent. Others experienced fear, rejection, and a desperate clinging to familiar reality, unable to accept that everything they thought they knew about the universe was about to change. Dr. Chen's monitoring equipment registered the moment when the global electromagnetic field shifted into a new configuration. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Earth's entire energetic signature had been altered, as if the planet itself was being prepared for something unprecedented. "This is it," she whispered to Dr. Webb, as they watched the readings stabilize into patterns they had never seen before. "Whatever they've been building toward, it's about to happen." Around the world, those who had been touched by the Watchers felt the same certainty. The preparation phase was ending. The moment of choice was at hand. Humanity stood at the threshold of a transformation that would either elevate the species to unimaginable heights or leave it behind in the cosmic flow of evolution. The night sky began to change. Stars that had been constant for millennia started to pulse with new rhythms. The aurora borealis appeared at latitudes where it had never been seen before, painting the heavens in colors that had no names. And in the spaces between the stars, vast shapes began to resolve themselves, no longer hiding their presence. The Watchers were revealing themselves at last, and with them came the weight of a choice that would determine not just the future of humanity, but its very definition of what it meant to be human in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. The final phase was beginning.